Another little block about the Apple security story that kind of started and took over our lives yesterday. Let's talk a little bit more about it here, because we've definitely had some things kind of bubble up over the past 24 hours. First up, Google CEO Sundar Pichai announced his support for Apple on Twitter. Let's just say it was brief. But I would say nice to hear at least something. And that old sentiment appears to be shared with other tech companies. Some are offering very delicate signs of support. Others offering a little bit more than that, actually, late breaking before the show. And then, of course, some are saying nothing at all. Up until a few minutes ago, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook hadn't really commented on it, even though this absolutely, in the grand scheme of things, affects them. Though they are part of the Reform Government Surveillance Coalition. And that coalition did offer a statement of support, not for Apple necessarily, but against the whole backdoor pursuit, let's say. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey tweeted like an hour ago direct support for Apple. It was very brief. Facebook released a statement to USA Today with strong support for Apple, saying it would set a chilling precedent and obstruct companies' efforts to secure their products. And Amazon isn't really talking right now. I think what I find interesting, though, is, like, I understand that because a lot, every company that I mentioned there has some sort, in one way or another, has some sort of stake in this in the long term. And I find it interesting that it took so long to get anything out, and that when it does come out, in at least a couple of the cases, it was worded not necessarily in a Apple, we support you, we've got your back. If we were there, we would be in the same position, as you, and we'd be doing the same things. Like Google's, for example. This is important, instead of saying something like, we support Apple. What do you think, Matthew? Do you think that these companies should be offering more direct support, or are they just kind of protecting their butts, staying out of the crosshairs in this?
Well, I think they're definitely, trying to hedge their bets. I mean, they've got to, think about not just what Apple's going through, but what's going to happen in the future. What could they be compelled to do? What sort of relationship do they have with security agencies? What sort of relationship do they have with the government? And so if they kind of, jump on Apple and say, yeah, we're totally with Apple, and we resist every, attempt to do anything, that could cause problems for them in the future. I mean, part of me wishes they were a little bit less kind of mealy-mouthed, or whatever you want to call it, that they would say, look, we want to stand firm as an industry. And I think they're trying to do that, but it feels like in some cases their heart isn't really in it. And, there's another dynamic between Google and Apple. Apple has made privacy a huge part of its, unique selling proposition, unique sort of offering. So we keep everything private. We don't care about advertising to you. Obviously, Google is different in a way, not that it doesn't care about your privacy, but its whole business is based on knowing you and kind of tracking you, but asking you first, and then hopefully telling you what it does with your data. So I think Google's sort of views on not encryption and sort of the government hacking into your phone, but on sort of privacy in general is somewhat more nuanced than Apple's. Apple's just far to one end of the spectrum, and that's great. That's what Apple sort of users have come to expect.
Where do you think China plays a role in this? Because I mean, in some sense, Apple has just marched into China. They're selling lots of iPhones. They haven't had much trouble. Where all the other companies, the big companies, are having trouble because they're a different company. They run things differently, and they have to run up against. So now here's the thing. A lot of people are saying well, what happens here is going to also affect the iPhones in China. And so is what you're saying about Google? They're kind of sitting back and saying, well, now you got to say something. Welcome to the fight. Is that what you're saying that Google's stance is here?
In a way, I think that could be part of it. Anytime China comes up, there's a huge amount of conflict in all the companies involved because they want to do business there. It's a massive, massive market, and all of China is sort of developing, and lots of people want phones, and they're going to want new phones, and so you've got this gigantic market, and yet you've got this basically totalitarian government and all sorts of kind of concessions that you would have to make, some of them pretty huge, in order to do business in that country. And so anytime you're kind of Leo mentioned this actually in the discussion we were having on Twig. That, Google and Apple both want to do business in China, so they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too, in a way. The risk in this particular case is if, depending on what Apple does, and I think that in part this is why the FBI is doing this, that precedent is going to be heard around the world. It's not just going to be something that applies to a phone in the US. And so, everyone in China is going to be watching. The Chinese government's going to be watching. Mm-hmm. They're going to use whatever happens as a way of sort of pushing their own agenda, which is to be able to get into people's phones and watch what they're doing at all times. And how Apple deals with that, or how Google deals with that, that's going to be a tough one.
So what do you make of the internet rights groups that, the group, internet right groups Fight for the Future, that they were protesting outside of the Apple Store? What do you make of that?
I think it's great. I think protesting is great. And I would like to see a bit more kind of regular users and people getting involved. I'd like to see a bit more, and maybe this is part of that. Maybe that's what they're trying to get going. It feels a little bit like, Apple and the FBI and a couple other tech companies are going to figure out what happens here. I think we all have a stake in that, right? This is going to affect us in some way, even if we don't even have an iPhone. Yeah. It's probably going to affect us. And so I kind of would that's why I feel it's so important to sort of boil down what's going on and try and explain it to people, and maybe not have to use terms like secure enclave and on chip encryption.
As awesome a word as enclave is, yes.
Yeah, secure enclave sounds awesome, and I would like to have one in my house. But to try and just get at the sort of root issues. And obviously one of them is, the authorities need to get into this guy's phone because he committed a crime. But the potential ripple effects of that are so huge. Mm-hmm. It really is mind-boggling. It's just hard to boil down sometimes.
Yeah, you work for a pretty mainstream, publication. Do you feel? I feel like I'm in this bubble of people that just love and care about and think only about technology. Do you feel like normal people are talking about this and understanding this?
In my sort of limited experience, no. So civilians, as I like to call them, haven't
Muggles.
Really, started coming up to me and saying, "Do I have a secure enclave?" Or I think they're. I think it is going to happen, though. It is kind of leaking out into the normal world, and it will become an issue. So the hard part is how to kind of frame it in a way that makes sense to people. And you find yourself falling back on kind of real world analogies like, well, imagine there's a lock on your house, and other houses have a similar lock, and so. And the master key and so on. And in a way, it's actually way more complicated than that. Yeah. But, but sometimes you have to sort of get out of the abstraction to what it's going to mean to people who just own phones.
Well, I might be putting you on the spot here, but how would you explain it to someone? Like for the people, like how do we explain it to the muggles in our life, the normal civilians in our life?
I guess I would just, I have explained it as just, the FBI wants into this phone. Certain things on the phone are preventing it from doing that. And so in this case, the FBI wants, a court has ordered Apple to alter the phone so that the FBI can basically crack it or hack into it. And that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of what we're dealing with. The risk is if Apple does that for this phone, maybe it could be done for all sorts of other phones. And if they create something that modified OS for that phone, who's to say it won't escape into the wild and then give lots of people, including bad people, the ability to get into your phone?
right before the show, Anthony Nielsen here at TWiT sent me a link to some news that Senator Richard Burr, who's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, is apparently drafting legislation to criminalize the refusal to cooperate in basically aiding decryption for an investigation of this type. I don't think that it necessarily calls out, well, as it wouldn't, Apple specifically, but it's directly tied to this. So, who knows the influence of this over time, but that's happening as well.
Well, do you
and
think
that's a hugely frightening development,
Yeah.
right? Like that would be a hugely, it feels a little to me like there are certain forces within the U.S. government and the military establishment who want to make it effectively seem either illegal or just bad to even use encryption at all, to even use any kind of privacy, enhancing software. The simple fact that you use Tor, for example, basically is like a red flag for security agencies. Why are you trying to cover up your web activity? Clearly, you're doing something wrong. So, even the fact that you're using that, I think they want to make that seem like it should call into question your patriotism or whatever, which is a frightening development.
Mm-hmm. Or the argument that everyone makes, like, I don't do anything wrong. Why do I care if Apple, I don't have anything to hide on my iPhone. I don't care, and it's interesting. I have a good friend who, is a civilian, and, it was surprising to me because she brought up Serial, the podcast, where I think that's where sometimes, it reached people that, you can be wrongly accused. People are upset about the miscarriage of justice. So I think sometimes framing it that way, like you never know what something you might have said might imply that you did something that you didn't do. So it's interesting. I mean, we talked a little bit before the show, Matthew, about the iCloud backup. So this phone, apparently, I've read that the FBI does have some access to some of Farouk's iCloud backups from his phone, but then maybe he's turned that off. I mean, this is sort of an example. This is kind of another thing. This isn't really about this phone, and this isn't really about San Bernardino, and it isn't really about, it's bigger than that. But what is can the FBI just look into, iCloud backups? Do they need a warrant for that? How does that fit in here?
They do need a warrant, is my understanding. So, but it's not any different than it's, those are relatively easy to get. We have reason to believe XYZ is happening in this iCloud backup, or information that we need for this case. And then they would get access to it, as they have in this case. They have access to at least to multiple backups, and then at some point they stopped. And that's why they are trying to get into the phone. I don't know this, obviously, but I actually believe that in a way, that is just a justification for trying to force Apple's hand and allow the authorities to do this so that they can set a precedent. Because there have been multiple requests made to Apple, like dozens, that are very similar. And in every case, Apple has resisted. And so I think someone said, look, we got to have a test case. And this is a good one. It was a horrible crime. And we need to force Apple to do it so that then we can say, look, you did it in this case, you should do it in this other case.